Thanks to Tripp Jennings and Attorney General Torres. The second part of their conversation is coming up in a little over 15 minutes. Right now, we want to put the Yazzie Martinez case in context. What prompted it, the state's struggle to comply with a court order, and the implications of the Attorney General stepping in. To tackle all of that, executive producer Jeff Proctor leads a special panel with 3 different perspectives on the case.
Thanks, Lou. Joining me around the table are Regis Pecos, the former Coche de Pueblo governor and co-founder of the Santa Fe Indian School Leadership Institute. Across the table, you've already heard from Tripp Jennings, executive director at New Mexico In Depth and my former editor, and current APS board member and senior fellow at the One Generation Fund, Danielle Gonzalez. Thank you all for being here. I would like to begin by kind of taking a step back to July 2018 when Judge Sarah Singleton made her ruling in the Yazzie Martinez case. Regis, what conditions existed in New Mexico public schools at that time, and why was this case necessary?
It really was, first of all, an affirmation of what has been documented over the course of the last 150 years with regard to what devastating results become reality from weaponizing education as a form of assimilation, in this case for indigenous children. The culminating affirmation is what the first indigenous-led study had affirmed was necessary to create new systems and institutions to redefine education so that education is balanced with all of the core values necessary for the maintenance of the ways of life for indigenous people. The low education attainment manifesting in poverty, manifesting in hunger, in health disparities, cycles of violence, and ultimately the highest rates of suicide in the nation here in New Mexico, and among those taking their lives are Native children.
That is some deep and historical context. Danielle, there's no chance to get to everything that was in the judge's order, but if we could maybe summarize a little bit, what did Judge Singleton order the state to do to begin to start to heal and rectify what Regis just described?
What's interesting about Judge Singleton's order is she looked at a variety of different factors. One was looking at what she calls inputs and outputs to make her decision. So in terms of inputs into the system, what are the things that adults who are responsible for the educational system have control over, and are those adequate and sufficient? So she looked at everything from buildings, facilities, desks, pencils, to some of the less tangible things like teachers and their professional development, teachers and their training, instructional materials, and curriculum. So are those inputs sufficient and adequate enough to meet the needs of the 4 groups that she mentioned as at risk, and that which are, as Regis mentioned, Native American students, students with disabilities, English learners, and low-income kids. So she found those inputs are inadequate, and then she looked at the outputs and she characterized those in 3 ways. One is test scores, one was graduation rates, and the other is college remediation rates. So when our kids are leaving our K-12 system, are they having to do remedial courses in higher ed? The answer was yes, and she cited a whole litany of data on that. So that was the kind of the main thing, is the inputs and outputs. There were 2 other things that I think are really important though. One is New Mexico actually already had in place and has in place a lot of the right policies, the laws in our Indian Education Act, in our Hispanic Education Act, in our Bilingual and Multicultural Education Act, and in our state constitution. So on paper, our state has committed to this culturally responsive, relevant, and adequate education already. So she found that that's there, but we're just not doing what we need to be doing to meet those laws. The other thing is she looked at funding, and funding in a couple of ways, which is I think a little bit unique to other education lawsuits. She looked at, is there adequate funding and how is it being spent? And again, found on both fronts, we're not meeting the charge. So we're not putting enough money into the system, and we don't have enough accountability over how it's being spent, again, on those inputs and outputs. So it was a pretty rich decision, and like you said, we don't have time to go into all the details, but there's a whole lot to dig into there, which really is a call to action for all of us in education.
Stemming from, at the end of the day, a rolling constitutional violation. At the end of the day, what she determined was that our education system, our public education system here, was a rolling violation of the state constitution, right?
Absolutely.
5 years have now passed since Judge Singleton issued her ruling. Tripp, I know New Mexico In Depth has covered Yazzie Martinez pretty extensively. I'm curious, in the course of the stories that you've published, people you've interviewed, people your reporters have interviewed, what has the sense from them been in terms of progress in complying what we just laid out?
You know, there's a conversation about money that's being spent or maybe new allocations. You know, that conversation is one conversation. Then there's a separate conversation about curriculum change, about getting, teachers who maybe look like the students in their classrooms. And I think on the monetary conversation, the state has made some progress in talking with some of the folks that we've interviewed, but I think there are those who say it's not as much progress as they should have made, especially in a time period where you have historic surpluses. The other thing is, as far as curriculum change, getting more the pipeline of teachers, I think there needs to be a lot of work. That's what we're hearing from people. I think that there's a lot of frustration with not as much progress as was hoped for. I mean, that ruling was 70 pages, but I think the findings of fact were like 600 pages. And if you read through that, it is extraordinary what Judge Singleton, found and then put out there publicly. And I will tell you that I've covered education and, here and there in many states, not just New Mexico. That was a wealth that opened my mind to some of the things that were happening around districts, rural and urban. And I think that there's not been as much progress as a lot of people hope for. Something that Regis and I have talked about is that, frankly, we've had federal reports dating back to 1928 about education in states, the Merriam Report and then the Kennedy Report in the 60s. Thank you, Regis, for pointing those out to me. I think it's just not a lot of as much progress as they thought there should be.
You mentioned the word frustration, and I'm going to ask you a question in just a moment. Frustration, I think, is a theme that we'll get to a little bit, but let's catch viewers up to where we are now. Obviously, the Attorney General has said that he would like to take over the state's role in litigation on Yazzie Martinez. So I have to ask the two big questions. He says he has the authority to do this, Regis. So my questions are, does he? And if, in fact, he does, should the public expect a change in terms of the progress that we've been talking about?
I'm not an attorney, one to conclusively respond to that question. But if he does, then I think it is a welcome opportunity, as many have expressed as a result of the frustration of what reflects very little movement in the last 5 years. And so Chairman Lente, as one example, publicly stated just a few days ago in a convening here with tribal representatives from Navajo Nation, Mescalero, Jicarilla, and the Pueblos, that if that is what one helps to change by bringing people to the table, then it's a welcome opportunity. Not so much one targeting the governor or PED in that lack of movement, but the crisis that we're in compels us to look at how collaboratively we are moving through these discussions. And so if his entrance helps to move us by bringing plaintiffs, as he's articulated, to the table, then I think it's a positive entrance into the dynamics of the stakeholders moving forward.
Even philosophically, right? Even if it's just a philosophical shift, to get more people to the table. So people tend to think of the Attorney General as a prosecutor. We use that phrase top cop, the state's top cop, all the time. So even from a public perception perspective, Danielle, is the Attorney General's office the right place for this to live, leadership in the state's role in this case?
Yeah, so I'm of two minds. I do agree with Regis on the perspective that maybe this is the kick in the pants that is needed to bring some accountability, to bring some action, to bring some needed conversations with the right people. On the other hand, keeping this in the court system, in our criminal justice system, and the legal system is probably not what's best ultimately for our students. I think legal fees are going to continue to mount up. How else might we better spend those funds? I think, it's kind of likening it to a custody battle. You can continue to have mom and dad fight over the kids, but does that ultimately benefit the kids? And I think the other thing is that this is just another technical fix. I started with mentioning that we had all of the right laws on paper. We have the right paper there, we have the right laws, we have enough money, to your point. But I think what's really needed is the deep cultural shifts, the mindset shifts, the healing that you've talked about, which is not going to happen through our court system. It's not going to happen through subpoenas. It's not going to happen through plans and legal documents. It's going to happen through deep work, deep relational work at the level closest to kids and families. And I think that's what's still really missing from this whole conversation around progress or lack of progress with this.
To politicize this will only result in losing the merits of what collectively we have to contribute in addressing the crisis in education. And to your very point and analogy, none of us want to see children be the pawns in a whole nother level of who's right, who has the legal right. That is what we don't need at the moment. So embracing the challenges on all parts, the executive, the legislative, the Attorney General in his discussions about entering this really should be one that we collectively embrace to all come to the table and begin to roll up our sleeves and respond in a collaborative way if we're going to shift the paradigm.
You just answered one of my questions, and I appreciate you getting there. And I want to stick a pin in the politics for just a moment. Tripp, you just finished interviewing the Attorney General right over on the other part of our set. I'm curious what your takeaways were in terms of his interest in this case. What stuck out to you in the course of your conversation?
I mean, I think that, what he expressed it seemed to be a real passion for this. He mentioned that his own father's story was kind of really moved him. His father grew up in a mostly Spanish-speaking home, so he really identified with the educational programs that his father went through and some of the deficiencies, as well as his mom being a public school teacher. I think that he's prepared to, I know we talked about, maybe not getting lost in the possible turf battle institutions. Political, but institutional battle. I think he's prepared to probably push that if there's some challenge to him taking this over. He has spoken that in other states, attorneys general have this kind of power to protect children and whatnot. I got the sense that he seems like he's going to move forward on this if he's challenged. Those were my takeaways on the conversation with him.
So I want to spend just a moment on the politics of this. It would be very difficult to not see this as a piece of a whole. Obviously, the Attorney General very publicly just refused to defend the governor's public health order and a firearm carrying ban in public. It's tough not to put that together with this. But Regis, to your point of not placing children and their education and their well-being in the middle of something like this, how does that get accomplished in the kind of hyper-partisan, even though these are two members of the same party, fight that we tend to see on the political landscape now?
I think you have to unpack all of those elements legally, politically, to really get back at the heart of what we have to do. Because this issue, this crisis, really has been generationally. We've not had the opportunity of why there was such great optimism with this landmark decision. For Indigenous peoples, this is really the first opportunity to redefine education, where language and culture is at the heart, and education is not weaponized to be a process of assimilating us. We are at the point in this journey where language is the most fragile as a result of generational attacks on something that is central to who we are, central with the maintenance of a way of life. So if we fail, our elders teach us that when language is lost, culture will be as well. And when you lose those two, the elders say that there is no more us in the way that the Creator gifted us language and culture and a way of life, that every generation before us have sacrificed, have pushed back. And if we fail in this time, the question we always ask is, how will future generations speak of us? Or to ask the question, what do we want most that future generations inherit from us? And at the very center of that answer is language and culture for the maintenance of a way of life.
I knew this was going to feel way too fast, but that's unfortunately all the time that we have for the first segment. But we're not done yet. We'll meet right back here in less than 15 minutes to talk about the Attorney General's involvement in a different education issue New Mexico in Depth brought to light as well: harsh disciplinary tactics at the largely indigenous Gallup-McKinley schools.